Genetic inheritance is the process by which organisms take their DNA, take copies of their genes, and pass them on to their offspring. To do this, most sexually reproducing organisms are going to do it through sex. They're going to do it through combining sperm and egg. And so what you're doing with sperm and egg is each of them, a sperm and an egg, actually have half of the overall chromosomes or DNA that an individual would have within their body. So if we normally have 46 chromosomes as humans, we actually have 23 chromosomes in sperm and 23 in an egg. What that allows humans to do is when you have sex and sperm meets egg, you are combining two different sets of DNA to create an entirely new set of 46 chromosomes. One that, yes, resembles mom and it resembles dad, but in a lot of ways, the exact mixture of those genes is entirely new, which makes you the unique individual that you are. So what this means is we actually have two genes for each trait. We have a gene from mom and we have a gene from dad. Here's my public service announcement. This means that if you're planning on reproducing, and I may not have to tell you this, but be very careful about who you reproduce with. The child that you create will have 50% of the traits of the person with whom you have sex. That could be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. So be careful. Sperm and egg meet. And when you have those two sets of genes from sperm and egg meeting, some genes will become active and other genes will not. So you have two sets of genes, but depending on what those genes look like, sometimes they'll have an effect on a person's development, other times they will not. And probably the most basic way to understand genetic inheritance and thereby how these genes then affect development is through the concept of dominant and recessive genes. You may have heard about these in your introduction to bio classes. Often teachers will use Punnett squares to explain it, so I will not break the mold here. I will do the same. Usually eye color is the go-to example. Turns out eye color is controlled by a very simple set of genes. And so if you're talking about dominant and recessive, what dominant refers to is if you have the gene, so if you have two copies and you have a dominant one of those copies is a dominant copy, that means that that trait will be expressed no matter what the other trait is. Versus a recessive gene is one that's only expressed if there's not a dominant gene there. So when we talk about eye color, it turns out brown eye color tends to be a dominant gene. So here we can have two parents, all right? At the very top you have big B and then little b, meaning you have a big B dominant gene paired with a little b recessive gene. And let's say that this is the father. So the father has this combination of genes, but what the father will end up developing are brown eyes because he has this brown dominant gene. Same with mom. The mom also has big B, little b, therefore she has brown eyes. Well, when a man and a woman reproduce, when sperm and egg meet, what's going to happen is these genes are going to get shuffled together. So there's a probability, there's a chance that the child is going to inherit a combination of these four sets of genes. They could receive both brown dominant genes. They could receive, like their mom and dad, a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, or they could be separate. They could be different from mom and dad and inherit both of the recessive genes. In which case, because you don't have a brown-eyed gene, the recessive gene gets to be expressed, and that's where you get blue eyes from. So these can get mixed together in different ways, and so we can calculate the probability that a child has a particular trait. Well, given that the child simply needs one copy of this dominant brown-eyed trait, we can say that the probability of a child having brown eyes is 75%.
In this Punnett square here, you can see that 3 out of the 4 individuals would develop brown eyes. And then only 1 out of 4 of the children would develop blue eyes. So we can make some guesses about how a child is likely to develop based on the genes that the mom and dad have. There are many different patterns of inheritance. This is just one, and I want you to be familiar with how this works. Most traits are not this simple. Most traits end up being what are called polygenic. So when we talk about polygenic inheritance, this is when a trait is controlled by more than one gene. Some prominent examples are height and intelligence. Height is, you've probably noticed this, depending on what your mom or your dad, so your mom and dad are probably of different heights, maybe. This is the most common situation where the man tends to be taller than the woman. You probably noticed that you're not some perfect compromise between the height of your mom and the height of your dad, though you might be. Often what you might see is that you more so resemble the height of your dad or more so resemble the height of your mom, but you're not exactly the same height. You're a little bit different in some way. You're some compromise between the two. What's happening is height is controlled by so many different genes that when sperm and egg meet, you're shuffling together this large quantity of different genes. And so you can get many, many, many different possible combinations of height, and therefore be really any height that ranges between your mom and your dad. Now, some of you may be saying, well, geez, I'm actually shorter than both my parents, or I'm taller than both my parents. Genes are not the only thing that contribute to height. It's also your environment, your nutrition. So it's possible, especially if you're taller than your mom and your dad, it's possible that they did not have the same kind of nutritional opportunities or developmental opportunities that you did. Maybe you had a more ideal environment or circumstance. Therefore, maybe one of your parents had a gene for height, but they didn't have the building blocks, the resources to actually embody that height. Whereas you did, you inherited it, and because you had excellent care, you are now much taller than both of them. Intelligence is the same way. Intelligence is a highly heritable trait. Most of intelligence seems to come from what you inherit from mom and dad. But it's not as simple as, again, you get either the intelligence of your mom or you get the intelligence of your dad. You are going to inherit many, many, many different genes that collectively, as you add up the effect of each gene, you then get some grand total of intelligence, some grand sum of intelligence. That's polygenic inheritance. And then we can also talk about genetic and chromosomal disorders. So something can go wrong with the genes, with how the DNA is coded, and something can go wrong with how chromosomes are inherited. I've already talked about sickle cell anemia. This is a trait that is carried by a recessive gene. So if your mom or dad have a copy of this gene, it's very possible that they don't have the trait, but if your mom and your dad both had this recessive gene, you could have inherited both recessive copies, and therefore you have sickle cell anemia even though they don't. Sickle cell is also funny in that there is some amount of there's some amount of expression that can happen of the recessive gene even if there is a dominant gene. So this is not a perfect example of dominant recessive. Often what you'll see is if there's someone who has a dominant and a recessive sickle cell gene, they will develop some sickle cells within their body, but they won't develop enough that it causes this this pathological or this undesired amount of exhaustion, inability to transport oxygen, susceptibility to blood clots, etc., etc. So this is one of those odd examples where dominant recessive does not entirely describe it. And then with Down syndrome, Down syndrome's you can you can see what Down syndrome looks like. A lot of the symptoms, there are physical symptoms as well as psychological ones. The physical ones is often the face seems kind of pushed in, it's flatter, the eyes are spaced wider apart, but really the hallmark is usually some amount of intellectual difficulty. Now, this is not to say that those with Down syndrome are incapable of holding down jobs that require a good amount of intelligence, because there are plenty of examples of that. But those who have Down syndrome will, in one way or another, be set up for more difficulties in that domain. What this is caused by is an extra 21st chromosome. So it's also called trisomy 21, as you may have heard. Trisomy means 3 chromosomes, where you should only have 2, one from mom, one from dad. This is when the sperm or the egg is being created. For some reason, just by accident usually, the chromosomes did not fully split. So you end up getting 2 sets of chromosomes in one sperm or in one egg. Then when that sperm or egg combines with another, you end up getting 3 copies of the chromosome. Trisomy 21, or Down syndrome. Okay, that concludes the basics of genetics. Next time I'd like to get into, well, how do these genes then lead to some of the early developmental steps we'll see before birth occurs, prenatal development before birth.